How are you doing? Hope you're fine, doing fine. How was it so far?
I'd say it's been going great so far.
Glad to hear. Yeah. So I'm an Android developer. I've been doing mostly Android development for the last 10 years. I'm looking forward for my next 10 years. Therefore, I think it's we will have a few lessons in here. Apps are a big thing nowadays. And the interesting part is that even after years and years, we still see big companies really struggling to have a great app. Some apps suck. Even with unlimited budgets, it's still a tricky thing to achieve. Therefore, I've shared some of my experience. I've been to ups and downs, and I think there are some things that I've done wrong in the past, and we can all learn from this kind of stuff. It will be quite basic. I really enjoy basic concepts. So everyone, I think, we can follow along. It's indeed Android-based, but if there's something specific, I'll go on and explain. So it's generally available. And for visual cues, I got a Hello World tattoo. Yeah, that's mostly it. I didn't really prepare so much for the intro, but let's see the rest of the presentation. Cool. Sharing my screen. All right. We will start with a cover story. Basically, it's cover story related to how I ended up in this position of actually presenting you this. And when I first started 10 years ago, my classes looked something like this. I got thousands of lines. It wasn't pretty. And for Android development, we use this class called activity. It's responsible for a certain screen. So for now, let's call an activity is a certain screen. That's it. Good. And with thousands of lines and with most apps having multiple screens, you at some point will see a code duplicate, an overlapping for whatever reason. And back then, my model was that code duplicates are the worst thing to happen. I was really fighting against them in the personal way back then with inheritance. I started using lots of inheritance. I would create a base activity class. All the other screen would go on and extend that. And that's it. I was doing a great job not repeating myself. But as with every concept, there's a lot of nuance into it. We need to learn a concept, unlearn it, learn it again, and so on. It's just part of what's so intriguing and interesting in this area. Therefore, in order to answer or find out what actually means to not repeat yourself for this kind of concept, let's ask some questions. Maybe that code in your class that you extracted in the base activity, maybe it's boilerplate, maybe it's the kind of code that you don't really want to write in every single class. Or maybe it's a feature, or maybe it's a feature that just happens to look the same as another feature. It's not actually the same feature. And to better answer these questions, let's take a simple example. So we have two features, A and B. Both of them have a list that with each and every row has some text. And for showing this kind of list, we would write in Android an adapter class. Basically, it's a class that makes showing a list inside the view. Good. But then after some time, maybe your product owner requires you to also add a picture to the feature B. At this point, you will need to have a decision. you could either just copy paste the previous class and add the image only to the later one, or you could just use an F and add the picture only to the second feature, creating the adapter. And go on, maybe choose your own, and let's see where it goes. Now, mostly I've been doing this presentation to students or graduates, and the common answer is that they would go for the later. They would create this kind of the adapter class, which putting this into perspective, at some point, it would be a really big class. It would be hard to actually manage it. It would be hard to, let's say, modify something without breaking other features. It would be quite easy to have some regression. But on the other hand, if you would go just with a separate class, you would just have more maintenance, be more evolutionary in this perspective of the isolated feature. All right. After some time, I had to learn something else, that my inheritance habits were not the best. So I had to start preferring composition over inheritance. Therefore, I kind of needed to start from scratch. I needed to start from learning something new, something different. Therefore, I started using a new design pattern called MVP. And it's something like this. You got your views, which then call multiple life cycles on the presenter. The presenter encapsulates the business logic for the UI, and then calls back for the view different methods through a proxy interface in order to make the view show in one way or another. And then you also get a model, preferably from the data layer. Then view models started being more and more popular on Android. Data binding was available back then. Therefore, I started doing something like a hybrid. I was doing an MVVMP, I was calling it. So after a while, we got more libraries from Jetpack. We got the dependency injection for view models. We got life cycles for models, for methods inside the view model. Therefore, the presenter became quite only boilerplate. There was nothing to it anymore. We then reached like the modern or popular nowadays, more popular MVVM that we use on Android. And by the way, I'm looking forward for more model view intent. Yeah, well, this is the overview for MVVM. This is how you could depict something high level for MVVM. And at the time, I had the experience, the opportunity to work inside really great teams that we all were doing clean architecture. We were basing or integrating this design pattern inside a clean architecture. Therefore, it was quite a surprising thing for me to see that MVVM was considered in some articles a full-fledged architecture. And with all respect, at this point, I think we are really just perpetuating some errors on the internet. I mean, I can see students, my students, at times, I can pinpoint what kind of tutorials they've been using, what kind of article they've been using. And until they actually reach the unlearning, there's a lot of time going on. Therefore, I was quite surprised to see someone seeing MVVM by itself as a full-fledged architecture. So, what's not to like, right? Indeed. In order to see how this might not be the best way to go forward, let's take this simple example. We have some view model. It has some method that uses a model a user model from a singleton, then also takes on the token for authentication. It then goes on and does an API request. It has, this is the model part. It has a really weak model, so it can map any kind of string to any kind of object. And on the callback itself also checks for an HTTP 200, logs some message or writes some file. Well, what I like to call this is spaghetti integration. I mean, there's no layering at all. So you might ask, well, what's wrong with spaghetti? And fair enough. Let's analyze this kind of approach from three entities, from three properties for such architecture. Documentability. Well, if you're going to need to explain this as then I wrote a callback for the request, and then I saw a method called on response, and then check for a 200, and then, well, if you need to sound like a kid going through his day at the kindergarten, then it might not be the best design. It should be really natural to explain what you're doing in there. What I like to call this is noble effect development, in the way that you don't take a step back and really think thorough for a solution, maybe read the documentation and see how things are considered normal for integration. But instead you just, and I see this with students, they just go into the callback, implement it there and go on and builds and ship, that's it. Such snowball effect development would increase with time, and with summer coming, you just end up with a big ball of mud. Then we got testability, another interesting property, and at times I get this, well, we're not going to test it. Well, it's not about testing it, it's just seeing if such code is testable enough. I mean, you can tell that that kind of code wasn't really the subject or wrote by someone who is interested in testing at any point. And also we got my favorite one, which is complexity, the KISS rule, keeping it stupid simple. And we see this a lot of times. I mean, we look into an app as a user, well, it's a simple app, it works, it's nice. And then looking inside the code, we see a lot of complexity. Why is it there? Why? What does it fix? Why is it needed to have such complexity? It's just needed most of the times. It's just a sign of bad design. I mean, of course, you could need a complex solution for a complex problem. Of course, it happens and it's interesting, but most of the times this complexity comes without any reason. And look at it. I mean, it looks like you're trying to, or someone had tried to rewrite their driver for their printers. It doesn't look right. And it's one of the main responsibility for software engineers, for consultants, software consultants. I think it's to actually push back on complexity. If it's not worth it, if the solution doesn't require such complexity, then just push back on it. Good. Well, let's move on and ask a question. What's the right architecture, mobile-wise or even Android-wise? Well, the popular answer here is that it depends. It depends. What are the use cases? What does the app do? Of course, and it's the right answer. It depends. But if we look into most apps and what they do, more than 90% are some UI with some local caching on the device and also integrate some APIs. Most of the apps are not as special as we would like to. Therefore, let's ask a different question. What would be a minimal architecture for apps? In order to answer this, let me go a bit through modularization. So you could have the classical modularization for the clean architecture with the core on business layer and the nice decoupling for the data and the presentation layer. Or you could go even vertically and have every feature on its own. But for choosing this kind of approach as a minimal architecture, let's take a look at this nice slide that it's actually from this presentation over here from Google I/O. This is the name for it, for building a modular Android app, where it states that once you start modularization or modularizing your app, you get a lot of benefits. But then if you add too much, the cost increases and the benefit starts to stall. Therefore, if we would consider modularization, we would need at least 2 modules. We would get this spaghetti over here and this nice pizza over here. And at this point, we got 2 sets of classes. We got this set of classes depending on this one. And some would argue like, well, you can do this inside a single module. Yes, you can, but I'd rather introduce an architectural limitation rather than maybe adding a fitness function. Otherwise, you just see your view model inserted into the database in no time. So what I'm proposing as a minimal architecture for Android is an MVVM pattern inside the app module, and then we get a repository pattern for the data library. And it looks something like this. So going further from the overview we had over MVVM, we get the nice repository interfaces and also define the models. So at this point, we got an integration layer. Then we add the mappers for decoupling the layers. And going further, we implement the repository. We then use multiple classes for encapsulating the logic for integrating different APIs, such as you might want to do some database or some server-side integration. What I also like about this, or what I think it's also important, is that with such architecture is having single responsibility for models. So we have a model for maybe integrating with a server, we have a model for database, a business model, and so on. Well, and all of this is not necessarily very rigid, and it doesn't have to be. It's quite basic, actually. Good. Well, and because we've gone the extra step and talked about a minimal architecture, let's talk about it as a concept and see why would we need such concept. Well, have you ever been required to write a proof of concept, and then you've done a great job, you have a good result for it, and everything goes well, and your client requires you to, okay, I want to publish this. Let's build this for an MVP. Well, a couple of times I had to actually have this harsh discussion where I would tell, well, this proof of concept is not good. It's just rubbish. We need to start from scratch. And quick and dirty wasn't really that quick anymore. It wasn't cheaper anymore. And it wasn't looking very professional on me. I'd argue mostly that quick and dirty kind of code is nothing else than a developer that is not ready yet to write good code. Unfortunately, it's way faster and cheaper to actually have a minimal architecture and build for production with a quick and clean solution. That's why we're proposing a minimal architecture. You'll get an evolutionary code, even for proof of concept. So also I'm seeing a lot of, not necessarily proof of concepts, but I see a lot of MVP. So you got the first version of your app published, and in a few years you need to rewrite it. Why would you do that? Why would you go for that? Well, it's not evolutionary enough. Of course, you will get the basics that we gone through. It's simple, it's documentable, and testing. You also need continuous integration and so on. And something that I really appreciate for this approach is something that also made a change for me. I'd say don't let your fellow juniors developers work on quick and dirty code. Don't have them doing that. It's just years of their life, or how was in my case for several years I was doing quick and dirty code and didn't really learn much from it. Therefore, a lower limit architecture would also be a great learning opportunity for our fellow junior developers. So, MVVM, it's a nice design pattern for UI. It has a nice decoupling for the data with the model, but it's not an architecture. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Mihai. That was very, very interesting how you started with telling a story and then tied it back to your examples. I gotta say, I was having flashbacks to very interesting conversations when you were talking about assuming that a POC can be a starting point for an MVP and having those expectations properly set and properly managed. Would you mind then sharing, just so that we can see the cameras better easily in the recording and stuff like that? If you need to back for answers questions, you can do it again. But
stopping the share, right?
Yeah.
All right.
It makes it easy on Zoom because then we can see our faces. I wanted to touch on something that you mentioned, that making things simple is hard, right? And it's one of the trickiest thing, and that's one of the reasons we talk a lot about refactoring. And we even had an earlier talk today about not being perfectionists, right? And trying to do things at the least less responsible moment. How would you, looking at a code or looking at a process, say, okay, we're moving towards quick and dirty instead of fast, and like a cleaner architecture? What would be the signs for you that that's what's happening right now in a product or in a code base?
Well, it's the basic elite is like the ones that I prefer. It needs to be something that I just looking at it, it's simple. It doesn't have unrequired complexity. It's testable. So those are like the basic ways of actually seeing if something is mockable, easy enough, and documentable. If you can draw it down with all the squares, you're not missing any squares, then good. It doesn't have to be like, okay, let's introduce all the design patterns that we know so that we end up somewhere. No, it's just, and this is an open question for each and every one of you. How lower would you go with the code and still consider it evolutionary?
I see. And that's where the graph you showed was very interesting as well, because there is an inflection point, right? There is a point where it stops being.
As with every concept, it keeps on giving. Yeah.
Exactly. That's why there's no silver bullet, and that's why the industry is always evolving, right?
Yeah.
I have a couple of questions here that I can mention. You were talking a lot about mobile, right? And you have a lot of years in Android development and whatnot. I really liked when you were talking, and you meant it kind of gave the idea that it's not because you're in mobile or in Android that you are an exception, right? So you could learn from other parts of the industry, from other domains and stuff. So would this idea that you're bringing for mobile be workable, or could work for other types of, let's say, JavaScript-based single-page applications and solutions like that?
I'd say, yeah, it depends. Again, it's this is an answer that I've provided. It will be maybe a different answer for a different Android developer, but you can do it. You can answer how low can I go with a minimal architecture. I think the basics, these concepts can apply everywhere.
It's generic enough that can be for hybrid approaches, Android, iOS, any
Yes.
type things that you have some sort of presentation layer and data layer repositories that you can.
Exactly. I mean, don't have your client tell him at any point, well, this is not working. It's not evolutionary enough. We can't continue work with it.
Makes sense. If I could pick your brain a little bit, you have a very provocative title. MVVM is not an architecture. How would you define it? What is it if you're not using that term?
If I would be choosing a different title?
What is MVVM? I mean, if it's not an architecture, what would be the catchphrase?
Of course, it's just a design pattern for UI with a nice decoupling with an extra model.
I see.
It has that extra model, but it's not enough. It's still spaghetti integration.
Makes sense.
It's a design pattern for UI.
A design pattern for UI, and then what you're proposing has some sort of, because things would have too many of components, then you could extract some repositories and some other ones to avoid the fallacy that you showed on your graph from Google.
Yes, if you can't actually have two sets of classes that one depends on the other and the other doesn't depend, it's bad, then it's spaghetti integration between the two.
Yeah, I remember the classic, you shouldn't inherit a boat from a car to reuse engine type joke. So yeah, I agree that. Now, circling back a little bit, because I did mention that usually there are not necessarily those exceptions, right? I work a little bit on the platform type of things in infra, and we're usually trying to say we're not that different, right? We shouldn't think that we are exceptions. But are there any exceptions that are unique to mobile that developers should consider when designing and when talking about those things?
I'll answer. I'll give my answer and hope it helps. Well, a few years ago, it was like, well, mobile devices are quite limited and don't have that much power. But it's not true anymore. For instance, we see the M1 on Apple that tries to also go for tablets and laptops and everywhere. So that's not a common answer anymore. But at this point, I'd say as a developer and for apps in general, you need to have a keen eye for user experience. So the Android and the iOS platforms change really quickly. You need to look forward for what kind of paradigms might change. So know your playground very well, and maybe also learn a bit of user experience so that you can be a middleman, a right middleman for pushing back on complexity. I mean, you might see at some point coming from maybe a QA or product owner, a few quirks for a product, for an app that fix something really modest, like 1% of the users might end up in something like this. And fixing 1% issues over and over again actually breaks the user experience for the rest of the 99% users. Don't add that complexity. Just take a step back and check on the user experience and see if there are any more better solutions in regards to user experience. So stay up in the game and maybe get a hang of user experience.
Yeah, I guess that's a good point. And for everything, right? Technology is supposed to solve problems, and our users are supposed to be the reasons why we're solving it. So keeping a focus on that. I appreciate that in the mobile world, that is very likely a little bit harder to get to the users. And I've heard stories. I'm not a mobile that much developer, but I've heard horror stories of getting code and stuff to the users and patching and stuff like that. I wanted to also touch on, you mentioned on the beginning that you're going to be talking about some basic concepts. And I think that that's great because usually, at least when I join talks, I'm talking more about trying to help generate a spark so that people can look further and engage in how to understand those. You said some links and you're going to share those slides. Is there anything else that somebody that might be listening to this might be looking forward to? Oh, I want to learn more, other than engaging with you on our Slack channel right after this. What can they look for?
Well, it's a great start on the Slack channel. I'm not sure if it will be something else that will be coming handy right away, but let's see.
Sounds good. I think I don't have any more questions for you. I'm sorry. I think we have a little bit of time.
No problem. So yeah.
If anybody wants to interact with Mihai right over to Slack, he will be over there. We'll have a little bigger of a break here. We have the next session on this track at 3:20 with Valentina Servile. And there is also another track talk happening right now on track number 2. If you want, oh yes, sorry, there are multiple times, 3:20 because I'm on Spain, 2:20 GMT. Just follow, there's a link, and there are multiple, all of the times are there on the website if you want to check our agenda.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Mihai.
Have a great one.